Okay,
I'm not saying that. You're jumping to conclusions.
Some of the attitudes I'm getting from the family.
Welcome back to my channel. There are moments in reality television that feel staged, rehearsed, or carefully edited to protect certain narratives. And then there are moments that slip through, moments so raw and unfiltered that they expose everything. What we just witnessed with Kody Brown was one of those moments. Not dramatic in the way viewers expected, not loud or explosive, but something far more revealing. A quiet confession, delivered casually, almost carelessly, as if it didn't carry weight. But it did. Because in that moment, Kody admitted something that changes how we see everything that came before it. He admitted that he lied. Not just a small exaggeration or a misunderstanding, but a deliberate, calculated fabrication. He created fake legal rules, invented consequences that didn't exist, and used them to manipulate Christine at one of the most vulnerable points in her life. And the most unsettling part? He didn't say it with regret. He said it with a sense of pride, as if he had outsmarted the situation. As if convincing the mother of his children to believe something untrue was some kind of strategy. That single confession didn't just expose one lie. It cracked open a pattern that has been quietly building for years. Because when someone is willing to fabricate something as serious as custody laws, you have to start asking deeper questions. What else wasn't real? What else was shaped, twisted, or completely invented to maintain control? For longtime viewers, this didn't come out of nowhere. It felt familiar. It felt like confirmation of something that had been sensed but never fully proven. The tone, the confidence, the way he dismissed Christine's confusion instead of addressing it, it all pointed to something bigger than one moment. This wasn't about misunderstanding the law. This was about power. About creating a version of reality where he remained in control, even as everything around him was slipping away. And suddenly, the past 20 seasons don't look the same anymore. They look like a carefully constructed narrative, one where truth and manipulation have been intertwined for a very long time. When you go back and replay that conversation, it becomes even more unsettling. Christine wasn't confrontational. She wasn't trying to challenge him or create conflict. She was simply trying to understand. Her questions were logical, grounded, and calm. "We weren't legally married, though," she pointed out, searching for clarity in a situation that didn't quite make sense. And instead of answering her honestly, instead of explaining the truth, Kody doubled down. He spoke with authority, with certainty, with just enough confidence to make his lie believable. That's what makes it so effective. Not the complexity of the lie, but the delivery. Because when someone speaks as if they know exactly what they're talking about, especially in a moment where you're already overwhelmed, it becomes easier to trust them than to question them. And Christine was overwhelmed. She was navigating the end of a decades-long relationship, planning a move, trying to protect her daughter, and stepping into an unknown future. In that state, she did what she had been conditioned to do for years. She trusted him. She assumed he knew better. She believed that there must be something she didn't understand. And that's where the manipulation becomes clear. Because it wasn't just about lying. It was about timing. It was about choosing the exact moment when she was most vulnerable and introducing fear into the equation. Fear that something could go wrong legally. Fear that she could lose control over her own child. Fear that she might make a mistake she couldn't undo. And once fear is introduced, logic becomes secondary. You stop questioning details and start focusing on avoiding the worst-case scenario. That's exactly what happened here. Christine began taking steps to comply with something that wasn't even real. She started considering legal processes, worrying about requirements, and carrying stress that never should have existed in the first place. And all of it was built on something Kody later admitted he just got creative about. That phrase alone says everything. Because this wasn't confusion. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was intentional. It was strategic. And it reveals a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond this one situation. What makes this entire situation even more disturbing is not just the lie itself, but the reason behind it. When Kody was later asked why he felt the need to invent something so serious, his answer was simple, almost dismissive: "I don't trust her." And that statement alone reveals everything about the mindset driving his actions. Because when you really examine it, there was no evidence, no behavior, no past incident that justified that level of distrust. Christine had never tried to keep the children away from him. In fact, she had consistently encouraged a relationship between Kody and their kids, even during the most difficult periods of their separation. She made it clear on camera that she wanted him to be present, that she valued his role as a father, and that she had no intention of interfering with that. So the question becomes, what exactly was he afraid of? And the answer isn't about Christine at all. It's about control. Because when someone begins to lose control over a situation, especially one they've dominated for years, they often resort to creating new rules, new fears, and new obstacles to regain that power. That's exactly what happened here. Christine was leaving. She was making independent decisions. She was stepping outside of a system that had defined her entire adult life. And Kody couldn't stop it. He couldn't convince her to stay. He couldn't emotionally manipulate her the way he once could. So instead, he turned to something else, authority. Or at least, the illusion of it. By presenting himself as someone who understood the law, who knew the consequences, who could guide the situation, he attempted to re-establish a position of dominance. And it worked, at least temporarily. Because Christine didn't have the same legal knowledge, and in that moment, she didn't have the emotional energy to fight it. But what's truly revealing is how casually he later dismissed the entire thing. There was no acknowledgement of the stress he caused, no recognition of the fear he introduced into her life, no accountability for the fact that he had manipulated her during a critical moment. Instead, he framed it as creativity, as if he had simply been thinking outside the box. And that mindset is what transforms this from a single lie into a pattern of behavior. Because when someone doesn't see manipulation as wrong, when they don't recognize the harm in what they've done, it means they're likely to repeat it. Over and over again. In different situations, with different justifications, but always with the same goal, maintaining control, no matter the cost. But to truly understand how deep this pattern goes, you have to look beyond this one moment and go back to a time when the stakes were far more serious, far more real, and far more devastating. Because this isn't the first time Kody's decisions, or lack of responsibility, have had consequences for Christine and her children. Years earlier, during one of the most terrifying moments of Christine's life, the cracks in this system were already visible. Truly was just a little girl, only 3 years old, when she suddenly became critically ill. What started as concerning symptoms quickly escalated into a full-blown medical emergency. Her condition deteriorated so rapidly that by the time she was rushed to the hospital, her organs were beginning to shut down. Doctors later revealed that if they had waited even a few more hours, she might not have survived. Imagine that reality for a second. A mother watching her child fight for her life, surrounded by machines, uncertainty, and fear so overwhelming it's impossible to put into words. And in the middle of all that chaos, where was Kody? He wasn't there when the early warning signs appeared. He wasn't the one monitoring her condition or recognizing that something was seriously wrong. Christine was the one carrying that burden, making those decisions, acting on instinct to save her daughter's life. And while the show captured parts of that crisis, what it didn't fully address was what came after. Because surviving the medical emergency was only the beginning of another battle, one that was financial, emotional, and deeply unfair. The hospital bill that followed was staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars, a number so overwhelming it could break most families. And yet, despite presenting himself as the head of a large family, as a provider, as someone responsible for the well-being of his children, Kody had not ensured that truly was properly covered. There was no safety net in place, no preparation for a crisis of this magnitude. And once again, Christine was left to deal with the fallout. While she was still processing the trauma of almost losing her child, she was also faced with the reality of how to handle a financial burden that never should have been hers alone. And what's most telling is how quietly this was brushed aside. There was no deep accountability, no real explanation, no moment where Kody fully owned the consequences of that failure. Life simply moved forward, as if something that serious could just be absorbed and forgotten. But moments like that don't disappear. They linger. They become part of a larger pattern, one where responsibility is avoided, where consequences are shifted onto others, and where the people who carry the heaviest burdens are often the ones with the least support. And when you connect that past to what's happening now, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because fast forward to the present, and we're no longer talking about assumptions or emotional interpretations, we're talking about documented reality. After years of separation, distance, and what Christine describes as minimal support, the situation has finally reached a legal turning point. Christine is no longer relying on conversations, promises, or verbal agreements. She's taken it to the courts. And what's being revealed is just as troubling as everything that came before. Reports indicate that Kody owes a significant amount in back child support, money that should have been consistently provided for the care and well-being of his own child. Not extra, not optional, not a favor, but a responsibility. And yet, instead of stepping forward and addressing it, instead of acknowledging the gap and making it right, the response has been defensive, guarded, and notably private. Legal filings, sealed documents, silence where there should be clarity. It's a stark contrast to the public persona that was built over years on television, a man who spoke endlessly about family values, about unity, about responsibility. Because when the cameras were rolling in earlier seasons, the narrative was clear. He was the leader, the provider, the one holding everything together. But now, when real accountability is required, that image begins to fracture. And what makes it even more striking is the imbalance that becomes visible when you look at how resources have been distributed. While one part of the family struggles with financial obligations and past burdens, another part appears to be living in relative stability and comfort. And it raises a difficult but necessary question: how were priorities decided? Who was protected, and who is left to figure things out on their own? Because when support isn't evenly given, when responsibility isn't equally shared, it stops being a family system and starts becoming something else entirely. Something selective. Something controlled. And Christine's decision to take legal action isn't just about money. It's about setting a record straight. It's about moving from a system based on trust that has clearly been broken, to one based on enforceable responsibility. It's about saying that the same rules that apply to everyone else also apply here. No more creative interpretations. No more shifting narratives. Just facts, accountability, and the kind of structure that should have been there from the very beginning. And just when it seems like the situation couldn't become more revealing, another layer unfolds, one that doesn't involve legal documents or financial records, but something just as powerful: the rewriting of history itself. Because in more recent seasons, Kody hasn't just been responding to current events, he's been reshaping the past. Specifically, his relationship with Mary. A relationship that viewers watched evolve over decades, one that was once described in his own words as foundational, meaningful, even deeply connected. For years, he spoke about Mary as his first love, the person who stood beside him in the earliest days, the one who helped build the very structure that the entire family was based on. There were moments of affection, moments of partnership, moments that, at the time, seemed genuine. And yet now, that entire narrative is being quietly dismantled. Kody claims that the love was never really there, that the connection people thought they saw was never real, that the marriage, from the very beginning, lacked the depth and authenticity that had been portrayed. And that shift isn't just surprising, it's disorienting. Because it directly contradicts years of footage, years of statements, years of shared experiences that were presented to millions of viewers as truth. So how do you reconcile that? How do you suddenly accept that something you watched unfold over time is now being described as something entirely different? That's where the concept of narrative control comes into play. Because if you can redefine the past, you can influence how people interpret the present. If the relationship was never real, then the breakdown isn't your fault. If the love never existed, then the pain of losing it becomes irrelevant. And in that sense, rewriting history becomes a form of protection, a way to shield oneself from accountability, from criticism, from the emotional weight of what actually happened. But for Mary, this isn't just a shift in storytelling. It's personal. It's the erasure of years of her life, her commitment, her belief in something that she was told was real. And what makes it even more significant is that she isn't staying silent about it. She's made it clear that she intends to share her side, to speak about her experience, to challenge the version of events that's now being presented. Because when one person starts rewriting history, the only way to balance that narrative is for others to step forward and tell the truth as they lived it. And suddenly, it's no longer just about what happened. It's about whose version of the story will be remembered. And if rewriting emotional history wasn't enough, the situation becomes even more complicated when you start examining the financial dynamics within the family, because this is where confusion, contradiction, and control seem to intersect in a way that's impossible to ignore. Over the years, viewers were led to believe that major financial decisions were made collectively, that resources were shared, and that each member of the family contributed toward a common goal. It was presented as a system built on unity, where sacrifices made by one would ultimately benefit all. But as more details come to light, that image begins to unravel. The conversation surrounding the Flagstaff house, in particular, reveals a very different reality. What was once described as a family-supported purchase is now being re-examined under a completely different lens. Contributions that were believed to be shared investments are being reframed as gifts that, apparently, were never meant to be repaid. And that shift in language is significant, because calling something a gift removes obligation. It erases the expectation of return. It turns a mutual agreement into a one-sided transaction. And yet, at the same time, there are conflicting statements about other assets, claims that certain properties or profits should be partially owned, partially shared, partially claimed. So on one hand, contributions flow in one direction with no expectation of return, while on the other, ownership and entitlement are asserted when it benefits the narrative. And that inconsistency isn't just confusing, it's revealing. Because when financial structures lack clarity, when agreements aren't clearly defined or consistently honored, it creates an environment where control can be maintained through uncertainty. If no one fully understands what they're owed, what they've contributed, or what they can expect in return, then the person managing that system holds the power. And for those on the outside of that control, it becomes increasingly difficult to challenge it, especially when the details are constantly shifting. What makes this even more impactful is hearing the perspective of those who were directly involved. When individuals begin to speak openly about their experiences, about what they believed they were contributing, about what they expected, about how things actually played out, it adds a level of clarity that was missing before. It turns vague assumptions into specific realities. And suddenly, what once looked like a shared financial journey starts to resemble something much more uneven. Something where certain sacrifices were made without equal return, where certain individuals carried more weight than others, and where the idea of fairness became secondary to maintaining a particular structure. And once that realization sets in, it becomes very difficult to see the system the same way again. But perhaps the most striking part of this entire unfolding story is not just what Kody says or does when he is in control, but what happens when that control starts slipping and even the people closest to him begin to challenge his version of reality. Because for years, one of the most consistent defenses of Kody's behavior was that others simply didn't understand his intentions, that he was misunderstood, that his actions were being misinterpreted through emotional bias or fractured relationships. But now, even that explanation begins to fall apart under pressure. In recent seasons, moments have surfaced where those within his closest circle begin to openly question him, not in dramatic confrontation, but in quiet resistance, in subtle acknowledgement that something isn't adding up. And that shift is powerful because it signals the breakdown of a narrative that once relied heavily on agreement from within. When even allies begin to hesitate, when even those who once supported the structure start pointing out inconsistencies, it becomes harder to maintain the illusion. One of the most telling dynamics is the growing tension surrounding communication, or lack of it, with his adult children. According to multiple accounts, relationships that were once central to his identity as a father have become strained, distant, and in some cases completely fractured. Yet on camera, There are still claims of effort, of outreach, of attempts to maintain connection. But those claims are increasingly met with contradiction, not from outsiders, but from within the family itself. Even Robin, who has often been positioned as the most aligned with Kody's perspective, has at times voiced concern about the disconnect, gently pushing against the idea that everything is being handled as it should be. And when those closest to you begin to question your narrative, it creates a tension that can't easily be dismissed. Because it's no longer about public perception or external criticism, it's about internal accountability. At the same time, the emotional fallout from these fractured relationships becomes more visible. Children who once grew up within a shared family system are now adults forming their own interpretations of what happened, what was real, and what was missing. And those interpretations don't always align with the version of events being presented. That divergence creates a kind of historical split, two narratives existing side by side, neither fully erasing the other, but neither fully reconciling either. And in that space, truth becomes contested. Not in a legal sense, but in an emotional one. Who gets to define what the relationship was? Who gets to decide what effort looked like, what love meant, what responsibility required? And when those answers differ depending on who you ask, the stability of the entire structure begins to weaken. Because at some point, consistency matters more than explanation. And when consistency is missing, people start trusting what they directly experienced over what they are being told to believe. And as these fractures deepen, what becomes impossible to ignore is how the younger generation within this family is now processing everything they've witnessed growing up. Because this is no longer just a story about marriages falling apart or financial disputes being exposed. It's about children becoming adults and finally beginning to speak, reflect, and question the environment they were raised in. And what they're describing is not a simple disagreement or normal family tension. It's something far more complicated, something rooted in emotional absence, inconsistency, and selective presence. Some of the children have openly expressed feelings of distance from their father, not just physical distance, but emotional separation that developed over years of feeling overlooked or deprioritized. And while every family has its conflicts, what makes this situation different is the scale, the structure, and the public nature of it all. Growing up in a plural marriage system meant that attention, time, and emotional energy were constantly divided. And according to what has been shared over time, that division didn't always feel equal or predictable. There were moments of connection, moments of closeness, but also long stretches of absence where certain relationships seemed to fade into the background. And as those children grew older, those experiences didn't disappear, they turned into questions. Questions about consistency. Questions about priority. Questions about whether their emotional needs were being fully seen in a system that was designed to balance many competing demands. And now, as adults, they're beginning to articulate those questions more clearly, sometimes privately, sometimes publicly, but always with a sense of reflection that comes from distance and time. What's particularly important here is that these reflections don't come from a place of hatred or hostility, but from confusion and unresolved emotion. The kind that develops when a child cannot fully understand why certain patterns existed in their upbringing. Why some moments felt stable while others felt uncertain. Why connection sometimes felt conditional rather than constant. And those unanswered questions don't just fade, they shape how those relationships evolve in adulthood. At the same time, the remaining structure of the family continues to present a very different image on camera, one that emphasizes effort, reconciliation, and forward movement. But the contrast between perception and personal experience is where the tension lives. Because what is shown publicly doesn't always match what is felt privately. And as more voices begin to emerge from within the family itself, that gap becomes harder to bridge. It creates a layered reality where multiple versions of the same story exist simultaneously, each shaped by perspective, emotion, and experience. And in that complexity, the audience is left trying to piece together a truth that may not be singular at all, but fragmented across years of lived experience. And now, after everything has been exposed, after years of tension, shifting narratives, financial disputes, emotional breakdowns, and on-camera contradictions, What remains is a family structure that looks nothing like the one that was originally presented to the world. Because this is no longer about plural marriage functioning as a unified system, it's about the aftermath of that system collapsing under its own inconsistencies. And at the center of it all, Kody Brown is still trying to maintain control over a narrative that has already begun to slip away from him. Even as legal actions move forward, even as financial responsibilities are questioned, even as relationships with his children continue to deteriorate, the instinct to manage the story remains unchanged. It shows up in how explanations are framed, how accountability is avoided, and how every conflict seems to be redirected into something else: misunderstanding, miscommunication, or external influence. But what makes this moment different from earlier seasons is that the audience is no longer only relying on edited storytelling. There are court filings, direct statements, and lived experiences being shared outside of controlled environments. And those real-world consequences don't fade with an episode cut or a confessional interview, they persist. Christine, in particular, represents a complete shift in that dynamic. She is no longer operating within the emotional structure that once defined her life for decades. She is making independent decisions, building a life outside of the system that once required constant negotiation and permission. And in doing so, she has stepped into a version of reality where she no longer needs to justify her choices to anyone who once held authority over them. Her separation is not just physical, it is structural. It removes the need for validation, approval, or fear-based decision-making. And that alone fundamentally changes the power dynamic that once existed. Meanwhile, the legal and financial disputes continue to bring forward questions that cannot be answered through storytelling alone. They require documentation, responsibility, and resolution. And as those processes unfold, they expose gaps between what was said publicly and what was actually handled privately. But perhaps the most important shift is happening not in courtrooms or interviews, but in perception. Because once people begin to recognize a pattern, once they see repeated behavior across different situations, it becomes harder to unsee it. The audience starts connecting moments that once felt isolated into a larger pattern of behavior: control when possible, deflection when challenged, and narrative reconstruction when reality becomes inconvenient. And whether intentional or not, that pattern now defines how many people interpret everything that came before it. In the end, this isn't just a story about one family's breakdown. It's a case study in how power dynamics evolve when control is challenged, when narratives are questioned, and when those who were once silent begin to speak. And as the dust continues to settle, one truth becomes clearer than ever: some stories don't end with resolution. They end with exposure. And once that happens, there is no going back to the version that was once believed.